He's my GOAT. Philipp Lahm said that about a manager, not a player. And people just accepted it, moved on, scrolled past it. Because that's how it works with Pep Guardiola. Every player who's ever worked under him eventually says something like that. Somebody calls him a genius. Somebody calls him the best coach they've ever had. This background noise at this point. Nobody blinks. But flip the question around. Forget what players say about Guardiola for a second. What does Guardiola say about them? That's a much shorter list. And it's a much more interesting one. Because here's a man who has coached Lionel Messi at his absolute peak, who built a midfield around Xavi and Iniesta that redefined how football is played, who turned Philipp Lahm into arguably the most tactically flexible defender of his generation, and who has spent a decade extracting things out of Kevin De Bruyne that most coaches wouldn't even think to ask for. Guardiola has worked with an almost absurd concentration of talent. Ballon d'Or winners, World Cup winners, players who will have documentaries made about them long after they retire. So when a man like that, who has literally coached the greatest player alive by his own repeated admission, picks out 5 names as the ones who shaped how he thinks about the game, that's not a casual opinion. That's a confession. That's Guardiola telling you, in his own words, what football intelligence actually looks like to him. And the wild part is, it's not really a list about talent. It's not about who could dribble the best or who hit the ball the hardest. Guardiola has coached players with insane physical gifts and barely mentioned them years later. This list is about something else entirely, the ability to read a game before it happens. The ability to solve problems most players don't even realize exist. 5 different types of football brain, 5 different answers to the same question. What does it actually mean to understand the sport at the deepest level? Let's start with the one who might surprise you first. Not the name most casual fans expect to lead a list like this. No Ballon d'Or. No iconic World Cup final goal people replay every year. But Guardiola has gone out of his way, more than once, to call Lahm the smartest player he has ever coached. Not the most talented. Not the most gifted. The smartest. Here's why that distinction matters, and why it's the perfect entry point for the whole video. When Guardiola arrived at Bayern Munich, Lahm was already an elite fullback, one of the best in the world in that position, full stop. Most coaches would have left it there. Guardiola didn't. He looked at Lahm and saw someone who understood football at a level that made his position almost irrelevant. So he moved him right back to central midfield. Not as an experiment, not as a one-off, as a long-term positional shift, in the middle of a team trying to win everything. And it worked. Immediately. The reason it worked wasn't athletic. Lahm wasn't suddenly faster or stronger in midfield than he was at fullback. The reason it worked is that Lahm understood the why behind Guardiola's system, not just the instructions. He wasn't memorizing where to stand. He was processing why he needed to stand there, what problem that position solved, what it opened up for the players around him. That's the difference between a player who executes a system and a player who could, if you asked him to, explain the system back to you and improve it. Guardiola has talked about this exact quality directly. He's described Lahm as operating on another level entirely when it comes to reading the game. Someone who could be dropped into almost any tactical setup and immediately understand not just his job but everyone else's. That's not coaching. That's not repetition. That's raw football IQ, the kind you can't drill into a player in training. You either see the game that way or you don't. Think about what that actually requires. To play right back, then center back, then central midfield, then even at the base of a back 3, at the highest level of European football, under different tactical demands each time, you need to understand spacing, timing, cover, and structure so completely that the specific position barely matters anymore. Lahm wasn't a right back who could also play midfield. He was a footballer who happened to play wherever the team needed a brain that particular season. Other players who worked alongside him noticed exactly the same thing. Xavi and Iniesta, 2 players we're going to get to shortly, and 2 players who know a thing or two about football intelligence themselves. Both publicly praised Lahm's ability to slot into basically any role and immediately look like he belonged there. That's not a compliment you get from your own environment. That's a compliment from Barcelona's midfield generals, about a German fullback turned midfielder. That tells you everything about how rare what Lahm did actually was. Let's be fair for a second, because it would be easy to overstate this. Lahm wasn't some tactical machine with no personality on the pitch. He had genuine quality, genuine technique, A career that included a World Cup won as captain of his national team. Nobody's pretending he was a robot Guardiola simply reprogrammed. But that's exactly what makes the comparison land so hard. Even with all of that natural ability already sitting there, it's still the intelligence Guardiola singles out first before anything else. Not the trophies, not the World Cup armband, the brain. There's also the discipline angle, which tends to get buried under the tactical talk. Across an entire career at the highest level, Lahm was never sent off. Not once. For a player who spent years in midfield battles against some of the most physical teams in world football, that's not luck. That's a player who understood exactly where the line was at every single moment of a match, and never crossed it. Positioning wasn't just about attacking shape for Lahm, it extended into defensive discipline, into knowing precisely when to commit and when to hold. That's the same brain just applied to a different half of the pitch. So that's entry number one. Not the flashiest name. Not the one that gets the YouTube thumbnail clicks on its own. But arguably the most important one to start with because Lahm represents something specific, tactical and positional intelligence in its purest form. The ability to understand a system so completely that you could be moved anywhere inside it and still make it better. Lahm understood shape. Next, we go from a player who understood the structure of the game to one who understood how to break it apart. If Lahm is the player who could be plugged into any shape and make sense of it, De Bruyne is the player who looks at a settled, organized defense and immediately sees the crack in it. Different type of intelligence. Different tool entirely. Guardiola has coached De Bruyne for the better part of a decade now, through injuries, through Premier League titles, through a Champions League that took years longer than it should have. And across all of it, one description keeps surfacing from people around the club, that De Bruyne functions almost like an extension of the manager's own thinking on the pitch. Not a player who receives instructions and follows them well. A player who processes the game at the same speed Guardiola does, in real time, and then executes decisions before most players have even finished reading the situation. That's forward-thinking vision in its most literal sense. De Bruyne isn't reacting to what's in front of him. He's playing to a picture of the pitch that hasn't fully developed yet. A pass into space a teammate hasn't sprinted into, a switch of play to a gap that only exists for the next second and a half. That requires processing speed that very few players in the world actually have. Most elite footballers are excellent at responding to what's happening. De Bruyne built a career on responding to what's about to happen. And it's not just the vision. It's paired with something Guardiola clearly values just as much. A competitive mentality that borders on obsessive. De Bruyne isn't a passenger in matches. He's been described by people inside Manchester City's setup as someone who takes losing personally in a way that shapes how the rest of the squad behaves. When De Bruyne is frustrated, the team knows it. When he's locked in, the team follows that energy. There's a telling moment in how Guardiola has spoken about pairing De Bruyne with other creative players, comparing that dynamic directly to how he used to build his midfield around Xavi and Iniesta at Barcelona. Think about that for a second. Guardiola, when explaining how a modern City midfield should function, reached straight back to his Barcelona blueprint and slotted De Bruyne into that same category of untouchable, system-defining talent. That's not a coincidence. That's Guardiola telling you, without quite saying it outright, which era he thinks De Bruyne belongs to. What makes De Bruyne particularly interesting on this list is that his gift is fundamentally different from Lahm's. Lahm made the existing structure better. De Bruyne creates danger by refusing to be contained by structure at all. He'll drift wide, drop deep, push high, whatever the moment demands, and every single one of those decisions is in service of one thing. Finding the pass, the shot, or the run that breaks the game open. And he backs it up with output that speaks for itself. Season after season of assist numbers that outstrip most out-and-out forwards. Goals from midfield that shouldn't statistically be possible for a player in his role. A trophy cabinet that reads like a highlight reel of English football's last decade. Now, to be fair for a second, De Bruyne's early years under Guardiola weren't some instant fairy tale. Injuries derailed entire seasons. There were stretches where City's attack looked disjointed without him on the pitch, which honestly says as much about his importance as any trophy does. A team built around a single creative brain is a fragile thing, and City found that out the hard way more than once when De Bruyne was sidelined for months at a time. But that fragility is almost proof of the point this section is making. You don't become the player a manager privately treats as irreplaceable by accident. Guardiola has restructured entire midfields, entire seasons around getting the best version of De Bruyne back on the pitch, because the alternative is losing exactly the kind of forward-thinking vision that doesn't show up anywhere else in the squad. So this is entry number 2, forward-thinking vision, married to a mentality that refuses to accept anything less than domination. If Lahm understood the shape of the game, De Bruyne understood the attack. He saw the picture before it existed and had the conviction to force it into being. Lahm understood shape. De Bruyne understood attack. Now we move to the player who didn't just play within the system, he was the system's heartbeat. If you've ever heard the phrase midfield general thrown around loosely in football commentary, Xavi is the reason that phrase exists in the modern game. Guardiola built his entire Barcelona philosophy, Tiki-Taka, the possession-based, suffocating control of the ball that changed how an entire generation of coaches think about the sport around one central idea. And that idea had a name, Xavi. This is where the list shifts again. Lahm was about adapting to structure. De Bruyne was about creating danger inside chaos. Xavi represents something different from both: control of tempo and space. The ability to dictate not just where the ball goes, but how fast the entire match breathes. Think about what that actually means on a football pitch. 11 players, 90 minutes, a ball that could theoretically move at whatever speed either team wants. And in the middle of all of it, Xavi decided the rhythm. Slow it down when the opposition wanted chaos. Speed it up the instant a gap appeared. Every single one of his touches was less about individual brilliance in isolation and more about controlling the collective heartbeat of the entire team. Guardiola relied on this more than almost anything else in his tactical setup. Xavi wasn't there to dribble past 4 defenders. He was there to make sure the ball almost never left Barcelona's control long enough for the opposition to even organize a shape against them. That's a different kind of genius. It's quieter. It doesn't show up on a highlight reel the way a De Bruyne assist does. But ask any coach in the world which is harder to replicate, and most of them will tell you it's Xavi's. The praise for Xavi from inside that dressing room has always circled back to the same idea, an almost obsessive relationship with the game itself. People who know him well have described him as someone who essentially never switches off from football, someone whose intensity around the sport borders on consuming. That obsession is exactly what let him process the game at a level most players never reach. You don't accidentally develop that kind of tempo control. You build it by thinking about football constantly, relentlessly, for years. And it wasn't lost on the players who lined up alongside him either. Teammates who watched him operate at close range have talked about how completely he understood not just his own job but the shape of the entire pitch around him, as though he could see patterns forming before they existed. That's the same quality Guardiola prized in Lahm, but applied to the very center of the pitch, where the entire match funnels through. Here's the thing that makes Xavi's inclusion on this list almost inevitable. Guardiola's entire coaching identity was shaped by playing alongside him and then coaching him. The control-heavy, possession-first football that Guardiola has taken to every club he's managed since Barcelona, Bayern, Manchester City, all of it traces back to watching one central midfielder dictate matches without ever needing to sprint past anyone. Let's be fair for a second here too, because Xavi's game genuinely wasn't for everyone. He didn't dazzle casual fans the way a mazy dribble or a rocket from 30 yards does. Commentators outside Spain spent years underrating him precisely because his brilliance was invisible in the way that matters most. It showed up in what didn't happen. The turnovers that didn't occur. The counterattacks that never got started because Barcelona simply never gave the ball away in the first place. That's the part that gets lost when people rank players purely on goals and highlight reels. Xavi's influence shows up in the shape of an entire 90 minutes, not in a single moment you can clip and post. And that's exactly the kind of value Guardiola has spent his entire coaching career trying to explain to people who only watch the ball. So that's entry 3. Not the flashiest highlight reel, but arguably the most foundational mind on this entire list. The player who didn't just play the position, he defined what the position could be. Lahm understood shape. De Bruyne understood attack. Xavi understood control. Now we move somewhere smaller, tighter, and in some ways even more difficult to teach, the ability to stay calm in spaces where most players panic. Here's where the list stops being about controlling large spaces and starts being about surviving impossibly small ones. If Xavi's genius was dictating the tempo of an entire match from distance, Iniesta's genius operated at close range in the tightest, most dangerous pockets of space on the pitch, the exact areas where most players lose the ball, get crowded out, or panic under pressure. Iniesta didn't avoid those spaces. He specialized in them. Guardiola has praised Iniesta in a way that's noticeably different from how he talks about the others on this list. Not just about football intelligence, but about a kind of composure that borders on unnatural. Guardiola once described Iniesta almost affectionately, pointing out that he doesn't need flash or image to be exceptional, that the substance is simply there, undeniable, without any of the noise other stars generate around themselves. That's Guardiola telling you Iniesta's brilliance didn't need decoration. It was self-evident on the pitch alone. And what made it self-evident was this specific skill, escaping tight spaces calmly rather than controlling the game from distance. 3 defenders closing in, no obvious passing lane, the kind of moment that ends most players' possession in half a second. Iniesta would take an extra touch, shift his hips, and simply not be there anymore. Not through pace, not through strength, through an almost supernatural sense of exactly where pressure was coming from and exactly how much space he actually had, even when it looked like he had none. Former teammates have described this using language that borders on magical, but the mechanism behind it is pure football intelligence. It's spatial awareness pushed to its absolute limit, reading 3 or 4 defenders' body positions simultaneously and calculating, in real time, the millimeter of space that lets you escape. That's not something you coach into a player in a few seasons. That's a footballing instinct that Guardiola clearly recognized as singular, even sitting inside a dressing room that included Xavi and Messi. It's worth pointing out how different this is from everything we've covered so far. Lahm adapted to structure. De Bruyne broke structure open with vision. Xavi controlled structure from range. Iniesta didn't need structure at all. He thrived specifically in the moments when structure collapsed around him, when the space disappeared and the pressure closed in. That's arguably the hardest skill on this entire list to develop, because you can't simulate that kind of chaos consistently in training. You either have the composure for it or you don't. Guardiola built passages of play specifically knowing Iniesta could get Barcelona out of pressure that would trap almost anyone else. That safety valve, that release point in tight areas, is part of why that Barcelona side could press so aggressively and dominate possession so completely, because losing the ball in dangerous areas was less likely with Iniesta on the pitch than with almost anyone else in the world. To be fair for a second, this style of play came with real physical cost. Playing that close to defenders, absorbing that much contact in tight areas match after match, year after year, took a visible toll across Iniesta's career. Injuries piled up. There were seasons where his body simply couldn't keep pace with what his mind was still capable of seeing on the pitch. That's the trade-off that comes with specializing in the most dangerous real estate on the field. You get exposed to more of the game's physical punishment than a player who operates from distance ever will. But even accounting for that, the composure itself never wavered. Watch any of his biggest moments on the largest stages football has to offer, and the pattern repeats. Pressure closing in, seconds ticking down, and Iniesta looking, somehow, like the calmest person on the pitch. That's not something injuries or fatigue ever managed to take away from him. So that's entry 4. Composure under pressure, in spaces where composure usually breaks down first. Lahm understood shape. De Bruyne understood attack. Xavi understood control.
Iniesta escapait de danger.
And now, all roads lead to the same place they always were going to lead. The player who Guardiola has praised more consistently, more emphatically, and for longer than anyone else he has ever coached. By now you can probably see where this is going, and that's intentional. Because this isn't really a countdown built around suspense. It's built around accumulation. For different forms of football intelligence, each one distinct, each one representing a different part of what it takes to read the game at an elite level. Tactical adaptability, forward vision, tempo control, spatial escape under pressure. Messi is presented as the player who somehow combines all 4 into a single footballer. Not one version of football intelligence. All of them layered on top of pure, decisive, match-ending ability. Guardiola coached Messi across 4 seasons at Barcelona, a stretch widely regarded as producing one of the greatest club sides in the sport's history. And across every interview since, Across more than a decade removed from actually coaching him day to day, Guardiola's language about Messi has never cooled into something ordinary. He has called him the best player he has ever seen, and been clear he doesn't expect to ever see another one like him. He's described watching Messi up close as something that reminds him of watching Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan operate. Athletes so far ahead of their contemporaries that comparison itself starts to feel inadequate. He's gone as far as calling Messi the greatest of all time outright, even while acknowledging that statement risks disrespecting legends like Pelé and Maradona. What's notable is what Guardiola actually points to when he explains why. It's rarely about raw numbers, even though the numbers are absurd. It's about how simple Messi makes the impossible look. Guardiola has described him as someone who doesn't need to be over-explained or dissected, someone you're better off simply watching, because trying to break down what he does analytically almost undersells it. And that's the through line connecting every single name on this list back to Messi. Lahm's gift was understanding a system so completely he could be moved anywhere inside it. Messi didn't need to be moved. Defenses had to reorganize their entire structure around wherever he decided to stand. De Bruyne's gift was seeing the picture of an attack before it existed. Messi didn't just see it, he could finish it himself from almost any angle at almost any distance. Xavi controlled tempo from range. Messi could slow a match down with one touch and then end it 3 seconds later with a run no defender could track. Iniesta escaped tight spaces through elite composure. Messi did the same thing, except frequently with 3 defenders draped on him, and finished the sequence with a goal. That's the synthesis. Not one specialized skill executed at a superhuman level. Every single one of those specialized skills, present simultaneously inside one player. And here's the part that actually separates Messi from every other name on this list, according to Guardiola himself. It never became routine. Coaches who work with genuinely great players for years eventually describe a kind of adjustment. Brilliance becomes the baseline expectation, and it stops feeling remarkable on a day-to-day basis. Guardiola has explicitly said that never happened with Messi. Even coaching him constantly, seeing him in training every single day for 4 years, the amazement simply never faded into normalcy. That's an extraordinary thing for any coach to admit, let alone one who has spent his career surrounded by generational talent. So there it is. 5 players. 5 distinct forms of football intelligence, each one representing a different way of reading and controlling a football match. And Messi standing at the end of that list not because he's simply the best, in some vague, generic sense, but because Guardiola sees him as the point where every other form of intelligence on this list converges into a single player. It was never really about pace. It was never about power or highlight reel athleticism. Guardiola's admiration across every single one of these 5 names comes back to the same idea again and again. Different forms of reading the game, different ways of controlling it, different answers to the same underlying question of what it actually means to understand football at the deepest possible level. So now it's your turn to weigh in. Out of these 5, Lahm, De Bruyne, Xavi, Iniesta, and Messi, which type of football intelligence do you personally rate the highest? The player who can slot in anywhere and elevate the system? The player who sees the attack before it happens? The one who controls the tempo of an entire match? The one who escapes danger no one else can escape? Or the one who somehow does all 4 at once? Drop your take, your verdict, in the comments below. I read every one of them. A like genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. And subscribe if you want more of this, real breakdowns of what actually separates the greats, straight from the people who coached them. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time.